somewhere south of the equator, in the summer of a year no calendar back then would have counted. The sky over what is now Indonesia turned the color of ash for 100 days. A mountain that had stood there, that people, or something like people, might have watched for their whole lives, simply stopped being a mountain. In its place, a hole. Not a crater you could walk to the rim of and look down into. A hole 100 kilometers long, 30 kilometers wide, big enough that today it holds a lake so large you cannot see across it, and at the bottom of that lake, the water is over 500 meters deep. Here's the strange part. Some scientists think that eruption came close to ending us. Not us as in some distant ancestor species. Us, you, every person you have ever loved, argued with, passed on the street. If one hypothesis is right, all of that very nearly didn't happen because a volcano in Sumatra 74,000 years ago pushed the human species down to a number of survivors small enough to fit inside a single high school gymnasium. But first, the mountain. The book that sent me down this rabbit hole is called When Humans Nearly Vanished: The Catastrophic Explosion of the Toba Volcano, written by a geologist and paleontologist named Donald Prothero. It came out in 2018, and what struck me about it isn't that Prothero hands you an answer. He doesn't. He hands you a detective story, one that runs through 4 separate fields of science that, for a long time, had no idea they were investigating the same event: volcanology, genetics, human evolution, mass extinction. Different scientists, different decades, different continents, slowly realizing they were all staring at the same scar. I should say now because it matters for everything that follows. I'm not going to tell you Toba definitely nearly wiped us out. Prothero doesn't claim that either, not flatly. What he does is take a hypothesis proposed by a real scientist in a real peer-reviewed paper and walk it through every scrap of evidence for and against it, honestly. That's what I want to do with you, because I think the true story, the contested, unresolved, still being argued over story, is more unsettling than a clean answer would be. A clean answer you could just accept and move on. This one, you have to sit with. So let's go back. Let's stand where the mountain used to be. Picture Sumatra, tens of thousands of years before anyone would think to name it that. A landscape that had, for a long time, simply been a landscape. Forests, rivers, a peak like any other volcanic peak in that chain of islands, quietly building pressure the way volcanoes do, 1 century at a time, unnoticed. And then, over the course of what geologists think was days, not years, not months, days, that mountain didn't erupt so much as it evacuated itself. Roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of magma, by the most careful measurements, blasted into the sky. Some estimates of the raw material thrown out run even higher, 4,000 or 5,000 cubic kilometers and more, depending on how you count it. Try to hold that number in your hands for a second. It won't fit. Nothing about a human life prepares you to hold a number like that. Here's a way in. Picture a swimming pool. Now, picture a lake you cannot swim across in a single day. That's what was left behind. Not a crater, not really a volcano in the shape you're picturing right now, cone-topped, snow-capped, postcard-ready. A wound. The earth turned inside out and folded back down on itself, and rain and time filled the hole with water until it became Lake Toba, 100 kilometers long, resting quietly today under a sky that gives no hint of what happened there. And the ash didn't stay in Sumatra. Picture India, thousands of kilometers away, across open ocean, across the width of a subcontinent's worth of coastline. And picture snow that isn't snow, gray, dry, falling for what must have felt like it would never stop, thick enough in places to bury the ground under a layer you'd measure not in a dusting, but in centimeters, in places meters. A layer of gray snow that never melts. That's Toba's ash, and it fell on a world with no name for what was happening to it. Now, here's where the story gets quiet and strange, because for most of human history, nobody knew any of this had happened. Not because it wasn't written down, there was no one yet to write anything down. It's because the evidence is, quite literally, invisible. In the early to mid-1990s, geologists piecing together ash layers scattered across Asia and reaching all the way into East Africa started finding something odd: microscopic shards of volcanic glass. 20 to 50 microns across, smaller than the width of a human hair, invisible without a microscope, turning up in sediment cores over 4,500 kilometers from Sumatra. Every shard carries a chemical signature, like a fingerprint left at a crime scene decades cold. And when scientists ran those fingerprints again and again across sites separated by entire oceans, they all matched back to the same place, the same eruption. Toba. Think about what that actually means for a second, because I don't think it's said often enough. For tens of thousands of years, that fingerprint sat there in the mud at the bottom of lakes and seabeds on 2 continents, waiting. Nobody could see it. It took modern instruments and a very particular kind of patience to develop what amounts to a photograph, negative 100 centuries old, and only in the last 30-some years has anyone been able to develop the print. That's beat 1. The mountain that isn't there anymore, and the invisible fingerprint it left across a third of the globe. Proven, solid, not contested by anyone. A supereruption happened roughly 74,000 years ago, and it was, as far as anyone can tell from the geological record of the last 2 million years, the largest explosive eruption there's ever been. Now for the part where it gets personal. Here's something you can check for yourself. And it's one of those facts that sounds like it must be wrong and isn't. Take any 2 chimpanzees, not different species, 2 individual chimps living in neighboring valleys of the very same forest. Genetically, on average, those 2 chimpanzees are more different from each other than you are from a stranger on the far side of the planet who doesn't speak your language, doesn't share your continent, doesn't share anything about your life. Humanity's entire genetic diversity, all 7 billion plus of us, is narrower than the diversity inside a single population of wild chimps. Sit with that for a second, because it's not a small claim. It means something happened. At some point in our deep past, our species went through something that squeezed us down, hard, and diversity takes a long, long time to rebuild after a squeeze like that. Genetics doesn't lie about this part. Something pinched us into a bottleneck. The question, the one that's been argued over in journals for going on 3 decades now, is what and when? And Stanley Ambrose thought he had an answer. In 1998, Ambrose, an anthropologist at the University of Illinois, published a paper that connected these dots in a way nobody quite had before. His idea: Toba's eruption threw so much sulfur into the stratosphere that it triggered what's called a volcanic winter, years of cooling, dimming, dying vegetation, and that this volcanic winter landed on top of a world that was already sliding into a glacial period. 2 disasters, stacked. And somewhere in that darkness, he proposed, the human population cratered. Not extinction, almost. A population crash down to a small number of breeding individuals. Genetics researchers elsewhere have floated figures somewhere in the range of 1,000 to 10,000 people surviving through the era when our mitochondrial lineages narrow to their thinnest point. I want to flag something carefully here, because it's the kind of detail that's easy to blur and shouldn't be. That population number comes from the broader genetics literature about human ancestry generally. It isn't a number Ambrose pulled directly out of Toba's ash. The link between humanity nearly vanished and Toba specifically did it is the contested part, and I'm going to keep being honest with you about that line every time we get near it. Ambrose went further. He proposed that whoever survived did so tucked away in isolated pockets of tropical Africa, refugia, small green islands of survivable climate in an otherwise volcanic winter world. That part is interpretation, dressed up as a mechanism, and it's worth knowing which parts of a story like this are measured and which are imagined to fill a gap. But here's what makes this a serious hypothesis and not a crank theory, and it's the reason I wanted to bring you a real book instead of just a spooky headline. Ambrose published this in the Journal of Human Evolution in a peer-reviewed paper as a working scientist making a testable claim. And for a while, it fit. It fit the ash, it fit the timing, it fit the strange, thin genetic diversity that every human on Earth carries and no other ape does. 3 separate fields of science, geology, genetics, archaeology, looking like they'd converged on the same terrible winter. If Ambrose is right, and I want you to actually picture this, not just hear it, everyone you have ever met is descended from a group of survivors small enough to fit inside a single high school gymnasium. Your ancestors. My ancestors. Every name carved into every gravestone in every country on Earth, traced back far enough, funnels down into that room. That's the hook. That's the version of this story that gets clicks and thumbnails. And for a long time, I think it's the version most people who'd heard of Toba at all walked away believing settled, proven, textbook fact. It isn't. And the people who went looking for proof in the dirt found something that told an entirely different story. In the early 2000s, an archaeologist named Michael Petraglia, then at Cambridge, later at the Max Planck Institute, went looking for the human side of the Toba story on the ground in southern India, in a district called Jwalapuram, in Andhra Pradesh. If Ambrose was right, this was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find catastrophe written into the soil. Close enough to Sumatra to catch the worst of the ash, far enough from any imagined African refugia that anyone living there should have been finished off. So picture the dig. Layer after layer of sediment, cut back like the pages of a book, and somewhere in the middle of it, a pale band. The Toba ash, not a symbol, not a metaphor, the actual physical residue of the eruption pressed into the earth as a single continuous sheet, a hard line separating before from after. Petraglia's team started pulling stone tools out of the layers directly beneath that ash band. Middle Paleolithic tools, worked stone, the kind of technology hominins were using across that era. Nothing surprising yet. Then they kept digging, up and through the ash layer itself and into the layers above it. And the tools kept coming. The same kind of tools, the same techniques, the same style of workmanship showing no interruption, no gap, no sign of a population that had been through hell and had to relearn how to survive. Whoever was flaking stone at Jwalapuram before Toba was still flaking stone at Jwalapuram after Toba the same way, like nothing had happened. Think about what that scene actually looks like, because I think it's the most quietly devastating image in this whole story. More devastating, in a way, than the eruption itself. Somewhere in southern India, less than 5,000 kilometers from the largest volcanic explosion of the last 2 million years. In the years after ash fell thick enough to bury the ground, someone sat down and picked up a stone and made a tool. And then somebody else did it the next generation, and the generation after that. Life, apparently, just continuing. Two witnesses giving completely different testimony about the same crime scene, one written in glass shards and genetic diversity that screams catastrophe, the other written in stone tools that whisper, calmly, we were fine. That's one hole in the apocalypse story. Here's the second, and it comes from mud at the bottom of a different lake on a different continent entirely. In 2013, a team of researchers, Lane, Chorn, and Johnson among them, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences using sediment cores pulled from Lake Malawi in East Africa, drilled originally back in 2005. Lake Malawi sits close to where Ambrose's refugia were supposed to have sheltered the last of us. If volcanic winter had struck anywhere hard enough to threaten a species, this is where you'd expect to see it in the mud. A die-off, a collapse, a scar in the sediment layers thick and unmistakable. They looked at subdecadal resolution, meaning not what happened over 1,000 years, but close to what happened year by year, decade by decade, fine enough to catch a multi-year winter if one had really scorched through there. And what they found was not much. No sign of the kind of ecosystem disturbance a true volcanic winter should leave behind. Their best estimate for the cooling in that stretch of East Africa, something like 1.5 degrees Celsius, not nothing, but nowhere near catastrophe, nowhere near years without a summer, nowhere near the kind of number that ends a species. So now you've got two separate lines of hard evidence, stone tools in India, lake mud in Africa, both pointing away from the apocalypse, and then genetics itself The very field that supplied Ambrose's strongest card started dealing some of that card back. A paleoanthropologist named John Hawks at the University of Wisconsin-Madison has been one of the clearest voices making this case. When you actually look at the timing signals buried in modern human DNA, the mathematical fingerprints that tell you roughly when a population contracted and roughly when it expanded again, they don't line up cleanly with 74,000 years ago. Not the way you'd want them to if Toba were the single cause. A short, sharp bottleneck at that one date doesn't fully explain the pattern of genetic variation researchers actually see, especially within African populations, where human genetic diversity is at its deepest and oldest. Some researchers instead point the finger at something else entirely, the later migration of humans out of Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago, as a more likely source of at least part of that diversity squeeze. So where does that leave us? Because I promised you honesty over a clean answer, and here it is, laid out plainly, the way Prothero lays it out in his book. 2 things are proven, and 1 thing is not. Proven, Toba really did happen, really was the largest known explosive eruption of the last 2 million years, really is dated to right around 74,000 years ago, really did bury Asia in ash and scatter invisible glass across 2 continents. Proven, human genetic diversity really is strangely, unusually low, lower than a wild chimpanzee troops, which means some kind of bottleneck really did happen to us at some point in our past. Not proven, and currently more disputed than supported, that Toba was the cause, that the eruption itself is the reason for the thinness in your DNA. Stone tools in India say the tool makers barely blinked. Lake mud in Africa says the winter, if it came at all, was mild. And the DNA itself, read carefully, doesn't sit neatly on the date. Ambrose's hypothesis is a serious, credentialed, peer-reviewed idea. It is not, as it stands today, a settled fact. And I think that's actually the more interesting place to leave it, because it means this isn't history. It's an argument still happening in journals right now this year between scientists who've each looked at the same ash and come away with different convictions. Now, let's talk about what the eruption actually did to the sky, because even setting the bottleneck argument aside entirely, the raw physics of it is worth slowing down for. A super eruption on Toba's scale doesn't just throw rock and ash, it punches enormous volumes of sulfur dioxide gas straight through the lower atmosphere and up into the stratosphere, above the weather, above the clouds, into the layer of air that doesn't rain itself clean. A 2023 study using ice cores drilled from both Greenland and Antarctica, a bipolar signal, meaning both hemispheres recorded the same event at the same moment, which is how you confirm a genuinely global eruption rather than a regional one, pinned Toba's stratospheric sulfate loading at somewhere around 535 metric tons, give or take about 96. To give you a sense of scale, that's something like 3 times the sulfate the 1258 Somala's eruption put out, roughly 6 times Tambora in 1815, which itself famously caused a year without a summer clear across the northern hemisphere. Something like 20 times Pinatubo in 1991, which measurably cooled the entire planet for a couple of years, and nobody living through it will ever forget the strange sunsets. Here's the mechanism in plain terms, because the phrase stratospheric sulfate aerosols means nothing on its own. Once that sulfur dioxide reaches the stratosphere, it converts into tiny reflective particles, aerosols, that hang up there, above the rain, for months or years, doing one simple thing: catching sunlight before it ever reaches the ground. A dimmer switch on the sun is the plainest way I can put it. Turn that dimmer down hard enough for long enough, and crops fail, and forests thin, and the whole machinery of a living planet starts to shiver. How hard did Toba turn that dimmer? This is, again, genuinely disputed, and I want to give you the honest range rather than pick the scariest number and hand it to you as fact. Some climate modeling has suggested global cooling on the order of 3.5 to as much as 9 degrees Celsius for several years running, numbers that, if true, would be nothing short of civilization ending, except there was no civilization yet to end. But more recent modeling, published in 2024 in the Journal of Climate, pushes back hard on those bigger numbers. That study argues the aerosol particles Toba actually produced were probably larger than earlier models assumed, and larger particles are less efficient at blocking sunlight. Their conclusion: even an eruption injecting this much sulfur may only be capable of something like 1 to 1.5 degrees of sustained cooling, which is a genuinely enormous gap. 9 degrees and 1.5 degrees are two very different planets, two very different stories about whether anything was ever truly at stake. And right now, nobody can tell you with certainty which one is closer to true. There's one more piece, separate from the temperature argument, that's worth sitting with. A 2021 study found that Toba's eruption likely caused severe depletion of stratospheric ozone across the tropics, a different kind of damage entirely, not about cold, but about the layer of atmosphere that filters out the sun's most dangerous ultraviolet light. That effect, the modeling itself, is solid. What it would have actually meant for anything living under that thinned-out sky, for skin, for eyes, for the plants at the bottom of every food chain, is far less settled, a second shadow cast by the same eruption that nobody has fully mapped. So hold both of these in your head at once, because this is the shape of real science, not the tidy shape of a headline. An eruption whose size is not in question, whose sulfur output is measured down to the ton, sitting on top of a climate effect that two respectable recent peer-reviewed lines of research disagree about by a factor of 6. And here's where the video you thought you were watching turns into a different video. Because Toba is not an isolated freak of geology, a one-off nightmare that happened once and never again. It's a smaller, faster performance of a script the planet has run before, at a scale that's almost impossible to imagine. Go back further than 74,000 years. Go back roughly 252 million years to the end of the Permian period, and you find the worst mass extinction this planet has ever recorded, one that erased something like 90% of all species alive on Earth at the time. The trigger wasn't a single eruption over a matter of days. It was the Siberian traps, not one volcano, but a vast sustained outpouring of volcanic activity that went on, in geological terms, for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, pumping gas into the atmosphere continuously, rather than in one violent exhale. Same mechanism, same physics, volcanic gas injected into the sky, altering the atmosphere faster than life can adapt to it. The only real difference between the end Permian catastrophe and Toba is scale and duration. One was a slow-motion strangulation of the entire biosphere over a long, punishing stretch of deep time. The other was a single held breath, days long, from one mountain, aimed at one species. Same weapon, different caliber. That's the pattern I want you to actually see, not just hear described. One geological process, rock, gas, sunlight, cascading downward, showing up at wildly different scales and doing structurally the same thing every time. At its largest, it can end 90% of everything alive on a planet. Scaled down, compressed into one mountain and one eruption and one narrow window of days, it may have come close to ending one species. Yours. The mechanism doesn't care about the size of what it's aimed at. Sunlight gets blocked, or it doesn't. Chemistry cascades, or it doesn't. Whether the casualty list runs to 90% of life on Earth or to a few thousand anxious primates in Africa is just a matter of degree, not of kind. It's the same knife, held at a different distance from the same throat. I find that harder to sit with than the volcano itself, honestly. Not because it's more dramatic, because it means what nearly happened to us, if it happened at all, wasn't special. It wasn't a targeted catastrophe reserved for the young, fragile beginning chapter of the human story. It was just physics doing what physics does, the same physics that has reshaped the entire history of life on this planet more than once, and we happened, this particular time, to be standing close enough to feel its breath. Which brings me to the part of this I keep coming back to, the part that doesn't resolve no matter which side of the Toba argument turns out to be right. Put your hand down flat in front of you for a second. Look at it. Every cell in it, every strand of DNA coiled up inside every one of those cells carries a signature, a kind of scar tissue, from something. We know that much for certain, whether or not Toba is the culprit. Human genetic diversity is thin, thinner than it has any right to be for a species our size, spread across every landmass and climate on Earth, numbering in the billions. Something, at some point in the deep undocumented past, took the number of people who would go on to become all of us and squeezed it down to a trickle. A genetic choke point in a river that, on the far side, widened back out into the 7 billion person flood you're part of today. Whether that choke point has a name, Toba, 74,000 years ago, a mountain in Sumatra, is still being argued by people with better instruments than I have access to, and I'm not going to pretend the argument's settled just because it makes for a cleaner story. But the choke point itself isn't in dispute. It's written into you, into the DNA in that hand you're looking at right now. You are, in some very literal sense, made of survivors. Not a metaphor, not a turn of phrase, an actual, measurable genetic fact about the population you descend from. A population that, at some point, was small, fragile, countable. And once you actually let that sit, everything downstream of it starts to look different. Every war that's ever been fought, every love affair, every betrayal, every act of kindness, every child born and named and raised, every empire that rose out of a river valley, and every empire that crumbled back into the dust it came from. Every single one of those events is downstream of however many people made it through whatever bottleneck it was that pinched our species down to almost nothing. If the number had been slightly smaller, if one particular winter had gone on a little longer, or hit a little harder, or landed on a group of people a little less lucky in where they happened to be standing, none of it happens. Not, history turns out differently. It doesn't happen at all. No wars to fight, no names to give children, no you sitting wherever you're sitting right now hearing this. That's the part that gets me, more than the ash, more than the cubic kilometers, more than any of the numbers. It's not really a story about a volcano. It's a story about how close to the edge the whole enterprise of being human may have run, at least once, maybe more than once, in the deep, dark stretch of time before anyone was around to write any of it down, and about how every single one of us, whether we know it or not, is still, in the most literal biological sense, counting the survivors. There's a piece of this story I haven't told you yet, and it's worth slowing down for, because it's the moment the whole mystery actually came together. The detective work itself, not just its conclusions. For most of the 20th century, these were three completely separate conversations. Volcanologists studying Lake Toba knew they were looking at something enormous, but enormous compared to what they didn't have a body count to compare it to. Geneticists working through the 1980s and into the 90s kept running into the same strange wall. Human DNA, wherever you sampled it, on whatever continent, showed less variation than it should for a species our size and age. That's a genetics problem. It doesn't come with a date stamp or a location, and archaeologists digging at sites scattered across Africa and Asia kept finding these odd, thin, pale bands in the sediment, layers that clearly meant something, but meant what exactly depended on who was asking. What happened in the 1990s is that these three separate decades-long lines of quiet, unglamorous fieldwork, glass shards, gene sequences, ash layers, got laid next to each other for the first time, and someone noticed they were all pointing at the same year. Not roughly the same era, the same date, reached independently by three different methods that had no reason to agree with each other unless they were all measuring echoes of one real event. That's the moment this stopped being three mysteries and became one. And I think that convergence, three unrelated fields of science working in isolation, arriving at the same 74,000-year mark from three completely different directions, is actually more persuasive on its own than any single piece of evidence inside it. It's the reason Ambrose's hypothesis got taken seriously by serious people in the first place, rather than dismissed outright. I want to be fair to Prothero here too, because part of being honest with you means being honest about where I think the book itself leans harder than the evidence fully supports. Prothero tells Ambrose's bottleneck hypothesis sympathetically. You can feel, reading it, that he wants it to be true, the way any of us telling this story want the pieces to click cleanly into place. That's not a flaw exactly. It's a survey book built around a compelling central idea, and surveys are allowed a point of view. But it means when you read the bottleneck as the explanation rather than an explanation, that's Prothero's sympathy talking, not settled consensus. The counter-evidence, Jwalapuram's undisturbed toolmakers, Malawi's mild cooling, Hawkes's genetic timing objections, sits right there in the same body of research, just as real, just as peer-reviewed, and it points the other way. So here's the fairest version of where things actually stand, said once, and plainly. Toba happened. It was real. It was enormous, and it's dated about as precisely as a 74,000-year-old event can be dated. Humanity's genetic diversity really is thin in a way that demands an explanation. Some ancient bottleneck at some point really did happen to us. What's missing, what's still an open case file rather than a closed one, is the line connecting those two proven facts into a single cause and effect. Maybe Toba is that line. Serious people think so. Other serious people, looking at the same ash, the same DNA, the same stone tools, think the timing doesn't hold and the real answer lies somewhere else in our past. Maybe in that later migration out of Africa 50,000 years ago. Maybe somewhere science hasn't fully located yet. I don't think that uncertainty makes the story smaller. If anything, it makes it stranger. A near extinction with no confirmed killer. A species carrying a scar with no fully identified cause. You'd think, with something this consequential, the possible narrowing of an entire species down to a room's worth of people, we'd have a tidier answer by now. We don't. And maybe that's the most honestly unsettling fact in the whole story. Not that a volcano may have nearly ended us, but that even now, decades into the investigation, with ice cores and ash fingerprints and genome sequencing at our disposal, we still can't say for certain what it was that nearly did. There's a term worth pausing on here because it changes how you should picture the number itself: effective population size. It doesn't mean the total headcount of a species walking around at a given moment. It means something narrower and, honestly, more revealing: the number of individuals who actually contribute to the next generation's gene pool. You can have thousands of people alive at once and still have a small effective population size if only a fraction of them are the ones whose children and their children's children are the ones who make it through. It's less a census than a genealogy, counting backward from everyone alive today to the actual thread of ancestors that connects to us, and finding that thread is thinner than the total number of bodies on the ground at any one time would suggest. That's part of why the bottleneck shows up so clearly in DNA and so ambiguously in the fossil and archaeological record. Genetics is counting ancestors, not corpses. And there's a formal term for what kind of eruption Toba actually was, one I've been describing without naming. Volcanologists classify eruptions on something called the Volcanic Explosivity Index, a scale that runs in practice from small local events up to a handful of catastrophes at the very top, called VAE8, super eruptions, defined by ejecting more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of material in a single event. In the last 2 million years of Earth's history, there have only been a handful of confirmed eruptions that even reach that category. Toba is one of them. Not the largest volcano that's ever existed on this planet, but among the largest explosive events geology has any confident record of at all. Try this for scale, held loosely, the way any comparison to something like a nuclear weapon has to be held loosely. Because the physics aren't identical, and I don't want to hand you a false precision dressed up as science. The energy released in an eruption like Toba's has been compared, by people trying to make the number graspable, to something on the order of a 1,000,000-ton hydrogen bomb, detonated not once, but repeated dozens of times over, in a matter of days. That's not a measurement, it's a gesture at scale, a way of making an unfeeling number feel like something, because 2,800 cubic kilometers doesn't land in the gut the way a bomb that size 40 times over in 1 week does. And I keep circling back to that ozone finding, the 2021 study, because I don't think it gets nearly enough attention next to the volcanic winter argument, and it deserves its own moment. Set the temperature question aside completely. Set aside whether it was 9 degrees of cooling or 1.5. A separate, compounding stressor, severe depletion of the ozone layer across the tropics, the very belt of the planet where most of the eruption sulfur would have concentrated. Ozone is the only thing standing between the sun's most damaging ultraviolet light and every living cell on the surface below it. Thin that shield out, even temporarily, and you're not just asking whether crops can grow in the cold. You're asking what direct sunlight starts doing to skin, to eyes, to the DNA inside every exposed cell of every living thing unlucky enough to be standing under that stretch of a sky. That's a second knife, separate from the cooling argument entirely, and it's one of the proven effects of the eruption, even while what it actually did to anything living remains far less certain, a shadow nobody has fully mapped onto a body count. Put those two things together. A dimmer switch turned down on the sun however far, and a shield thinned out at the exact same moment. And you start to understand why a hypothesis like Ambrose's, even now, even disputed as hard as it's been disputed, refuses to just go away. It isn't a wild guess. It's built out of real, measured physical stressors, stacked one on top of another, in a way that would test any population of any species, anywhere, at any point in its history. The disagreement was never about whether Toba could have been dangerous. It clearly could have been. The disagreement is about whether the evidence on the ground actually shows that danger cashing out into catastrophe. And on that question, as I've walked you through, the ledger is still open. Let me take you into that 1998 paper for a moment, because I think the way Ambrose actually arrived at his idea deserves more than a name and a date. He wasn't a volcanologist. He was an anthropologist, working through the tangled evidence of how modern humans differentiated into the populations we recognize today. And by the mid-1990s, he kept running into that same nagging problem the geneticists had been circling for years. Modern humans, genetically, looked like a species that had been through something, too uniform, too recently descended from too few ancestors for a species with our numbers and our reach. He wasn't the first to notice the diversity problem. What he did was ask a question almost nobody else in his position was positioned to ask, because it required knowing two entirely separate literatures at once. What, in the deep past, could have hit hard enough, fast enough to leave a mark like that? And when he looked at the timing, the volcanic ash record, the ice core sulfate spikes, researchers were starting to associate with a massive eruption near Sumatra, and the dates coming out of the genetic bottleneck studies, they sat close enough together that he put them in the same paper, under the same argument, for the first time. That's the move. Not a new discovery of ash, not a new genetic technique, a synthesis. Seeing that three unrelated data sets, gathered by three unrelated communities of scientists who barely read each other's journals, were describing the same shape. That's worth pausing on, because it's a particular kind of scientific courage. Publishing a hypothesis that reaches across your own field's boundary, knowing full well that volcanologists will check your geology and geneticists will check your population math, and both of them have every reason to find the seams. Ambrose published anyway, in a peer-reviewed journal under his own name, and the hypothesis has spent almost 30 years since being tested exactly the way he should have expected it to be, by people trying honestly to break it. Petraglia is a good example of exactly that kind of honest testing, and I don't think I gave his own arc enough room earlier. He didn't go to Jwalapuram to disprove Ambrose out of spite or rivalry. He went because the hypothesis made a specific, falsifiable prediction that a population directly in the path of Toba's ashfall should show some sign of disruption, some gap, some change in behavior if the eruption had been the disaster Ambrose proposed. That's good science working as intended. A bold claim, followed by someone going out with a trowel to see if the ground agrees. It didn't, not there. And to his credit, and to Prothero's credit for including it honestly in the book rather than burying it, that finding gets reported as what it is, a serious problem for the strongest version of the bottleneck hypothesis, not a footnote to wave away. I mentioned the 2023 ice core study earlier mostly for its number, that 535 teragram sulfate figure. But the method behind it deserves a moment too, because it's a small miracle of patient science. Researchers drilling ice cores in Greenland on one side of the planet and separately in Antarctica on the other went looking for chemical spikes in ice laid down around the same depth, the same age, in both places at once. Snow falls every year, compresses into ice, and traps a thin chemical record of whatever was drifting through the atmosphere that year, sulfate from a big eruption included. Finding a matching spike in both hemispheres at the same depth is how you confirm you're looking at something that circled the entire globe, rather than a regional event that only ash fell locally. That bipolar match is what let them pin Toba's date and its sulfate output with real precision, decades after Ambrose first proposed his hypothesis using far cruder data. Science catching up to a 30-year-old question with better tools. And, this is the part worth sitting with, confirming the eruption's scale in exact, careful detail, while still leaving the human consequences of that scale as unsettled as ever. And that 2024 climate modeling paper, the one that pushed the likely cooling down toward 1 to 1.5 degrees, that wasn't a study built to defend or attack Ambrose either. It was built to answer a much narrower, more technical question. How big, actually, are the aerosol particles a sulfur-rich eruption like Toba produces, and does particle size change how much sunlight they block? It turns out size matters enormously. Bigger particles let more light through than smaller ones do, gram for gram of sulfur. That's not a philosophical argument about ancient humans at all. It's atmospheric chemistry. And yet, because of how tightly this whole story is wound together, one narrow finding about particle size in a laboratory model reaches all the way back across 74,000 years and quietly rewrites how catastrophic the volcanic winter itself may or may not have been. That's what I mean when I say this is a live argument. It isn't just that scientists still disagree about old evidence. New evidence published within the last couple of years keeps arriving and keeps moving the line. There's one image from all of this I haven't fully given you yet, and it's worth the time, because it's the piece that makes volcanic winter feel like something other than a weather forecast. A single winter, in the ordinary sense, ends. The days lengthen, the ice retreats, green comes back. What a true volcanic winter does, if it's severe enough, is take that promise away, not forever, but for long enough that forever and long enough start to feel like the same thing to whoever's living through it. Years, not months, of a sky the wrong color. Years of harvests that don't come in if you're a species that has harvests yet. Or years of the plants and animals you depend on simply thinning out around you, generation after generation, with no clear signal for when or whether it stops. A single winter that never fully ends until eventually it does. That's the shape of the threat Ambrose proposed, whether or not it actually reached that severity here. Not one bad season. A multi-year unraveling of the ordinary rhythm every living thing on the surface of this planet has always depended on to know when to grow, when to breed, when to simply hold on. And I think that's worth holding next to the counter evidence rather than against it, because both things can be true at once, and that's the uncomfortable, honest shape of where this story actually sits. The mechanism was real, and it was genuinely dangerous. Sulfur in the stratosphere really can starve a world of sunlight for years at a time, and there is no serious scientist arguing otherwise. What's contested is whether Toba's specific eruption pushed that mechanism hard enough for long enough to actually break something as large and as scattered as an entire species, rather than simply giving it a difficult decade or two. A dangerous weapon was fired. Whether it landed a killing blow or a glancing one or missed the vital organs entirely while still leaving a visible scar, that's the argument that's still open, right now, in papers being written on both sides of it. I don't think that ambiguity is a disappointing place to end up. I think it's the honest one. Every fact I've given you tonight that sounds settled, the eruption's size, its date, its sulfur output, the strange thinness of human genetic diversity, is settled, checked, and rechecked across independent methods that all agree with each other. And every fact that sounds like it should be settled and isn't, whether Toba caused the bottleneck, how cold it actually got, whether anyone anywhere was truly pushed to the brink, stays open precisely because good scientists keep refusing to paper over the gaps just to hand you a tidier story. That refusal is, I think, the most trustworthy thing about this whole account. Nobody's trying to sell you certainty they haven't earned. There's a strange coda to all of this that I think about a lot, and it's not really part of the scientific argument at all. It's just true, and it's worth seeing before we're done. Today, Lake Toba is not a wound. It's one of the most striking, peaceful places in Sumatra. Clear water, an island the size of Singapore sitting inside it, people fishing from small boats, villages built along shores that used to be the inside of a magma chamber. Nothing about standing at the edge of that lake today tells you what happened there. No warning sign, no visible scar. It looks for all the world like any other beautiful lake, ringed by hills, holding the sky's reflection. That's the strangest part to me, stranger even than the numbers. The site of the largest explosive event this planet has produced in 2 million years has healed over into something serene enough that you could spend an afternoon there and never once think to ask what it used to be. I keep coming back to that because it says something true about deep time that's easy to lose inside all the sulfate numbers and the genetic percentages. Catastrophe, on a long enough timescale, becomes scenery. The land forgets, or at least it stops advertising. It's only in the parts of the record that don't erode as easily. Ice compressed layer on layer for tens of thousands of years, microscopic glass shards locked into seabed mud, and the DNA sitting quietly inside every one of your cells, that the memory of it survives at all. Everything else heals into a postcard, and that's really what the genetic diversity argument is asking you to believe when you strip away the ash and the caldera and just look at the biology. Mitochondrial DNA, the small, separate strand of genetic material passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, mutates at a slow, steady, roughly predictable rate. Trace those mutations backward across enough people, and you can estimate roughly how long ago all of those separate lineages funneled back down toward a much smaller set of women whose descendants are the only ones who made it through to today. That's the actual mechanism behind the narrow lineage point Ambrose leaned on. Not a guess, not a metaphor, but a measurable convergence point sitting somewhere back in deep time, whose exact date is still being argued over stone tools, ice cores, and lake mud in papers being written this year. So the lake healed. The forest grew back over the ash. The toolmakers in India kept napping stone like nothing had happened, and maybe, for them, genuinely nothing had. But somewhere else, in a version of this story we still don't have the full evidence to confirm or rule out, some population of early humans may have come close enough to the edge that the scar is still legible, tens of thousands of years later, in the DNA of every person alive to hear this sentence. What keeps this particular story with me, more than most of what I dig into for this channel, is that it refuses to resolve into either comfort. It's not a story where science eventually swoops in and confirms the scary version, the one where we really did almost vanish, and here's the definitive proof. And it's not a story where the scary version gets debunked and we all get to relax, because the underlying fact that something at some point squeezed our species down to a precarious number of survivors doesn't go away no matter which side of the Toba argument turns out to be right. The uncertainty isn't a gap waiting to be filled in by better instruments someday. Some of it might be. But some of it may simply be what's left when you try to reconstruct a single week 74,000 years ago from ash and mud and the mutation rate of DNA. There's a limit to how finely deep time can be read, no matter how good our tools get. And maybe that's the real reason Prothero built an entire book around a hypothesis he can't fully prove. Not because he needed you to believe Ambrose was right, because the search itself, 3 unrelated fields of science, decades apart, slowly discovering they'd been describing the same event without knowing it, says something true about how fragile the story of any species is to reconstruct, including our own. We are, every one of us, living proof that something survived. We're just still arguing about what almost didn't. Picture the lab work itself for a second, because I skipped past it too quickly earlier, and it deserves its own moment as a scene, not just a summary. A geologist, sometime in the 1990s, sitting at a microscope with a sediment core pulled up from far below a seabed or a lake floor, a tube of mud layered like a cake, each layer a slice of a particular year, going back further the deeper you go. Somewhere in that mud, invisible to the eye, is a scatter of glass. Not sand. Glass, tiny fragments thrown so violently into the air during an eruption that molten rock froze mid-flight into shards smaller than a grain of pollen. You cannot see them by looking. You extract them chemically, isolate them from everything else in the mud, and put them under magnification, and only then do these tiny glassy splinters resolve into something visible at all. And then the actual work begins, because finding glass isn't the discovery. The discovery is in the chemistry. Every volcano has its own signature, the precise ratios of elements locked into the glass when it cooled, as distinctive in its way as a fingerprint left at a scene. So the geologist runs the shard's composition against a library of known eruptions and watches the numbers converge again and again on one candidate. Not a guess. A match run independently on sample after sample, pulled from sediment thousands of kilometers apart by researchers who in some cases didn't even know what one another had found until the pattern became too obvious to be a coincidence. That's what it actually looked like to discover that Toba's fingerprint was sitting in mud from the South China Sea all the way to East Africa. Not one triumphant reveal, but a slow accumulation of matches, lab by lab, each one narrowing the odds that this was anything other than real. Now, hold that discovery method next to what it would have actually felt like on the ground, in Sumatra and outward from it, in the days and weeks the ash was actually falling. And here I want to be careful, because nobody alive recorded it, and I'm not going to invent a scene nobody witnessed. What the geology tells us plainly is the depth of what was left behind. Ash thick enough across South Asia, as far as India, to bury the ground under a layer running from centimeters up to whole meters in places. Not a dusting that settles and blows away by evening. A layer you'd have to dig through, walk across, breathe through, for as long as it kept falling and however long after that it took the wind and rivers to finally clear it. Whatever it was to live through that, day after day, under a sky the wrong color, breathing air thick with grit, the geology can tell us the ash was there. It can't tell us what it felt like. That gap between what the rock remembers and what a person would have experienced is exactly the gap Ambrose's hypothesis is trying to reach across, and exactly the gap that makes it so hard to close with certainty. There's a version of the refugia idea worth sitting with a little longer too, because I moved past it quickly the first time, and it deserves more than a sentence. If survivors really did cluster in isolated pockets of tropical Africa, as Ambrose proposed, picture what that would have actually meant day to day for whoever was there. Not a single dramatic last stand. A slow, grinding, generation-spanning narrowing. Fewer births surviving to adulthood, fewer of those adults finding others to pair with. Small bands growing smaller, some disappearing from the record entirely, while a handful of others, by nothing more than the accident of where they happened to be standing when the ash started falling, kept going. That's what a bottleneck actually looks like from the inside, if it happened at all. Not a single catastrophic night, but years, maybe generations, of a species living closer to its own edge than it had ever lived before, without anyone inside it having the faintest idea that was what was happening. Because nothing about a slow decline announces itself as the extinction event while it's underway. That's worth remembering when you picture your own ancestry running back through that gymnasium's worth of survivors. If that's the correct number, if that's even the correct event, it wouldn't have felt, to the people living it, like a single dramatic turning point in the story of a species. It would have felt like an unusually hard decade, maybe several of them, laid end to end. Nobody standing in the ash in Sumatra or hunting through a colder year in an African valley was thinking about the 9 billion people who might or might not descend from whoever made it through. They were just trying to get through the next season. That's the scale every real bottleneck actually lives at. Not mythic, not cinematic, just one hard year following another, until, on the far side of enough of them, there were still just barely enough people left to keep the species going at all. Take a breath. Hold up your hand again, the way I asked you to earlier, and look at it the way you looked at it then. Nothing about it has changed. It's the same hand, the same skin, the same quiet, ordinary miracle of being alive right now, reading these words, in a world you never think to question the existence of. But you know something about it now that you didn't at the start of this. Somewhere behind that hand, behind every hand that has ever reached for another one, in love or in grief or in nothing more than the dark, there may be a mountain in Sumatra that nearly ended the story before it could really begin. Or there may not be. The ash is real. The lake is real. The strange, thin thread of diversity written into every cell of you is real. Whether Toba is the reason for that thread, or only a violent, coincidental neighbor standing near enough to it in time to get blamed, that's still being decided in papers being written this year by people who care enough to keep checking. I don't think that not knowing is a failure of the story. I think it's the most honest thing about it. We are a species built out of survivors of something, even if we can't yet point to the exact night it happened. And maybe that's enough to sit with for now, not the certainty of a single volcano's guilt, but the quieter, stranger fact underneath it, that the number of people it took to keep all of this going was, at some point, small enough to lose. And it didn't. You're here. Everyone you've ever known is here. Take a breath. Feel it fill you all the way down. However many people it took to get you to this exact moment, breathing this exact breath, it was enough.